authoritarian governments have been both lauded and criticised for their handling of the COVID-19 crisis. While some argue that the most effective tracking and prevention technologies function best under authoritarian regimes, many fear that such technologies are opening the door to a greater role of the state in everyday life. Will the pandemic spell out the end of liberal democracy as we know it today? Joining me to answer these questions are Dr. Erica Frantz, who is an assistant professor in political science at Michigan State University and an expert on the security and policy implications of authoritarian rule. We also have Rami Khouri, who is a senior fellow and professor of journalism at the American University of Beirut and non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. And finally, we have Professor Lawrence Gostin, who is the director of the Georgetown University O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law and an expert in public health law. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. It is a pleasure to be hosting you. I wanted to start off today by talking about, I think, one of the most widely discussed instances of authoritarianism we've seen during the pandemic, which is Hungary. The pandemic has seen Viktor Orban in Hungary use his 2/3 majority to pass emergency legislation, which has then enabled him to rule by decree in Hungary for an indefinite period of time. The state of emergency was lifted finally 3 days ago. So Erica, I wanted to go to you and ask you a bit more about what these measures are and the way in which Orban has used his powers and used the pandemic for the consolidation of his own power.
Yeah, Hungary is certainly one of the most troubling cases that we're seeing, where we're seeing a clampdown and the leadership leveraging the pandemic to consolidate control. But I would add that we are seeing these developments in places that were already on fragile territory. And I think very few people would consider Hungary to have been democratic leading into the pandemic. And so, if anything, Orban is just leveraging this crisis to seal the deal. We are seeing similar developments in places like Guinea, which doesn't make the news as much as Hungary does, where they had a democratically elected leader, Conde, and he has used the virus to push through constitutional changes that paved the way for him to potentially have a third term. There's also trouble in Bolivia, where the interim president there is postponing elections under the guise of public health and so forth. So Hungary is not the only case where this type of development's happening, but I want to emphasize that where we're seeing this happening, all of these places were already backsliding prior to the pandemic.
So going to you, Professor Gostin, one of the things, again, just to talk about Hungary for slightly longer, one of the things Orban did under this act was to create a military task force to oversee the functioning of state-owned companies. So could you tell us a bit more about the role the military is playing in the state of emergency in Hungary and, as Erica said, more widely around the world?
You know, it depends. First of all, I should just say that, you know, as we're going to explore authoritarianism and in the interrelationship with COVID, it's going to be important to distinguish between leaders that have just literally used it to usurp power and those leaders who have at least ostensibly tried to use their power to curb COVID. And so places like Hungary and China both had very authoritarian rules. So did India. They're very, very different, and we're going to need to think of those in, you know, in a far different way. So, I mean, that's kind of my overview. Would you just mind repeating your question for me so I can come back to it?
Of course. So I just wanted to ask about the increased kind of role
in the military role.
Authoritarian states, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. You know, it depends. Let me just give you a little anecdote. It was really interesting. You know, during the West African Ebola epidemic, I was working very closely with President Obama and his team and encouraged the president to send military into West Africa, and in this case, Liberia, to try to help with the logistics, you know, building hospitals, tents, roads where medicines could go. And I went on our major um, uh, public health broadcasting program, and they asked me the question, Professor Gostin, I hear that the president has just done this, expecting me to be outraged that the military would go in, but I said I was delighted. So when military are used to help with their strengths to build hospitals, schools, logistics, getting medical supplies across skyways or roads, that's a good thing. But when they're used to clamp down, for example, again in West Africa, they brought their own military in to enforce a quarantine, which was a disaster. So a military where it's in service of public health is a good thing. When a military is in service of, taking away the rights and liberties of the population and extending the power of leaders, or if the military is just simply not trusted, like in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the current Ebola epidemic there, you have a very, very different situation.
Rami, I wanted to go to you next to talk about kind of this increased crackdown we have seen again around the world on opposition voices, be it journalists, opposition politicians, and so on. Could you tell us a bit about the precedent you think COVID-19 and the reaction to opposition and dissidents will set for Hungary and places like that around the world?
Let me talk about the Middle East and the Arab world, which I know best and follow closely. And ironically, the COVID-19 pandemic has provided an opportunity for many Arab governments, all of which, except maybe Tunisia, are autocratic or authoritarian or even dictatorial or in some cases despotic, and has given them a chance to regain some, let's say, credibility or even legitimacy in the eyes of their own people. Most of the Arab governments in the last 20 years have been steadily losing credibility in the eyes of their own people. The Arab world in the last 10 years, from 2010 until now, has been in a state of mass citizen uprisings to various degrees, not every country, but many of them. This has been a process of massive citizen discontent because of political, economic, environmental, many other reasons. And they're letting out their anger by asking for the whole government system to change in Lebanon, in Algeria, in Sudan, in Iraq. They're the most dynamic. Now, the COVID-19 gave the governments a chance to show that they can do something for their people. And a little bit like what Larry said, that sometimes an autocratic government with its military facilities can actually serve the people in some situations. And this is one of them. So it's a double-edged sword. So I would say that the COVID has provided governments some opportunities to regain a little bit of credibility, but also they have taken advantage of the situation to clamp down heavily on press freedom, freedom of expression, cultural dynamism. They've been arresting more people, closing newspapers, taking people to court or to jail. In some cases, like in Egypt, people disappear. And draconian measures like in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Morocco and Algeria of serious restrictions and penalties on the press for just issuing a true statement that the government doesn't like. So it's very much a mixed situation.
Professor Gostin, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I did. Rami, that's very, very interesting. And, if we really wanted to really drill down to what the core political issues have been with respect to COVID-19, you have to go to ground zero, which is China. And China has it's a similar kind of dynamic that you talked about. Now, the narrative that China and other strong leaders, Xi Jinping is really a strong man and has collected power. His narrative is, look, Europe's a mess. The United States is a mess. liberal democracies really can't cope with health or any kind of crisis, but we can, and we did. Look, we built a 1,000-bed hospital in Wuhan in a week. And that's the kind of narrative they put out. But as we're chipping away at the narrative, we're finding out, well, after all, liberal democracies can achieve better results. Because if you go back to China and you think about the dampening of civil society, the sanctioning and criminalization of whistleblowers, the chill on freedom of expression and social media, location apps on smartphones. These things actually ended up causing enormous delays. So lack of transparency really got us into a lot of these problems. Whereas it's true that Europe, the United States, and and other places around the world have stumbled and have undoubtedly had problems. But more often than not, there's civil society in the background pushing. There's opposition. There are journalists. And for me, the lesson that I really hope and pray will come out of COVID-19 is that truly, civil liberties, freedom, human rights, civil society, freedom of the press, they mean a lot. And I would rather that path rather than the path of, oh, well, authoritarianism works, which could happen in some places.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Erica.
Yeah, so just building on those observations, which are really important, the stereotype tends to be that, well, a strong man is going to be able to react quicker and build a huge hospital overnight and do all of these dramatic changes. And that is true in theory. In theory, these autocratic governments should have more latitude to implement dramatic changes. But what we see happening in actuality is very different. And just as a side note, in terms of economic policy, economic miracles and economic disasters both tend to happen in dictatorships. Democracies tend to have more steady economic growth patterns than dictatorships do, precisely for this reason that there's a lot of latitude. When it comes to these public health crises, there is some research that shows that democracies overall tend to do better in dealing with these outbreaks, and that's true even when controlling for levels of wealth. And the reason gets at what Lawrence was saying, that they have better information channels, they have more transparency, there's a vibrant civil society that can provide information which you desperately need to be able to handle a public health crisis. And add to this that oftentimes it's the case in dictatorships that all experts have been purged because they're seen as threatening. Well, then you get into the situation where even if the dictatorship did want to act swiftly, they might not have the type of information that they need to be able to do so.
I wanted to touch. Oh yes, Rami, go ahead.
Yeah, follow up on that, and to add to complete what I said in the beginning, I didn't want to give the wrong impression that I think that the authoritarian systems are doing well.
Oh no, we never thought that.
No one...
We didn't think that.
But the fact is that people are faced with a life and death situation,
Yeah.
and choose life, and therefore they follow the government's orders.
You're right.
In some cases, Lebanon, for instance, which is a country in free fall, it's collapsing economically, politically, environmentally, infrastructurally, and in many ways, they've responded really efficiently because it was mostly handled by medical personnel in government and private sector hospitals, and people trusted what they were doing, and therefore Lebanon has done quite well comparatively in terms of dealing with the COVID. But the reality is that this little pause has come at a time when the citizenry decided to listen to the government, obey its instructions on curfews and other things, wearing masks in public and things, and because they want to stay alive, which is totally understandable. The parallel reality to that is that they're just barely alive. In Iraq, Lebanon, Sudan, Algeria, Palestine, other places, there's massive poverty, which has been hugely exacerbated by the economic lockdown, the drop in oil prices, the drop in trade, the drop in tourism, drop in remittances, investments. Virtually every generator of income for these economies has either collapsed or significantly dropped by more than 50%. So these are societies across almost the entire Middle East, with the exception of one or two oil-rich countries, which have their own problems, that these are economies in serious, serious distress. They were already in distress, which is why people were out on the streets demonstrating. The Arab world, broadly across the region, according to the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which is done by people in Oxford and the UNDP and others, shows that about almost 70%, 70% of the Arab citizenry, of the 400 million Arabs, is poor or vulnerable. And this is an incredible figure, that the Arab world is a region of paupers. And it's been getting much poorer now and much more vulnerable because of the recent trends, and now with the extra pressure of the COVID lockdowns and the trade and the oil prices, the pauperization is going to explode. And therefore, people are anticipating that when things slowly get back to a situation where people can go out into the streets more safely, there's going to be huge demonstrations again. In fact, in Lebanon and in Iraq, those demonstrations have already started. About 2 weeks ago, people started going out. They don't care if they're going to die. People in Tripoli in northern Lebanon are saying, we're hungry, we can't eat. We're going to die anyway, so at least let's die with some dignity or something. So the pressures from a pauperized citizenry are enormous, and what they've generated as a response in most of the countries is the remilitarization, but the extra militarization of the state, where the states before the COVID, where most Arab countries were already turning to more military controls and snooping on people and arresting people. So what you have in the region broadly is a pauperized citizenry rebelling against a militarized state. And this is a really dangerous situation, which is going to be exacerbated. So the situation we're in now, where people listen to the government and in some cases are thankful for saving their lives, that's a momentary pause. And the real drive, the momentum, is for continued citizen uprisings and rebellion, and a demand in wholesale government change, not just little reforms like before. They want the whole system changed. And this is what's interesting in the 4 countries I'm studying, with the rebellions in Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Sudan. The demands of the citizens who are protesting for the last year in some cases has been for a wholesale change of the government. Get rid of all the existing people now and bring in a whole new system, which is not very realistic, but it tells you how deep is the disenchantment of the citizenry.
Erica, I wanted to ask what you think on this specifically, and I wanted to ask especially what role you think the media and kind of journalists and social media is playing in all of this. Do you think, how do you think the kind of role of authoritarian states is being reported to the rest of the world by the mainstream media and on social media?
Social media, I mean, I'm not a media specialist, but social media seems to be a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, it can spread information really rapidly, which is really helpful in a crisis. At the same time, it can spread rumors and lies really rapidly, which is troublesome. But I mean, I think an important point to emphasize is that, I talked earlier about how these governments were already kind of bad before the crisis hit, and now they're leveraging this environment. And we're seeing dictatorships do this with respect to their own media, in that they're using it as an opportune moment to crack down on journalists and so forth. They're also using it as an opportune moment to increase surveillance and to increase censorship on the internet. And that is troubling because we have done some research, some colleagues and I have done some research lately looking at digital repression, and the evidence suggests that those dictatorships, excuse me, that repress more heavily on the internet through, or not only just repression, but also misinformation campaigns, they tend to last longer in office than those that don't. And so this moment where dictatorships can really push hard on digital repression is not good in terms of pro-democracy movements and their viability.
Professor Gostin, did you have anything to add on this specifically?
No, I mean, I think, just in the health context, though, I mean, we've been talking about the importance of civil society to really kind of bring truth to power. And it's one of the best illustrations of that was another pandemic, and is another pandemic as we speak, which is the HIV/AIDS pandemic. I lived through the early days of AIDS. I saw all of the in-your-face advocacy of the AIDS movement. And in fact, in the United States, Larry Kramer just died, one of the pioneers of ACT UP in the United States, but one saw it in South Africa in the Treatment Action Campaign in Uganda and other places. AIDS changed the world. And for me, what it taught me was that a bottom-up social mobilization is the only way to have transformational change. And if you look at how countries responded to AIDS, the free ones tended to do better, certainly. Places like, Russia, which kind of damped down AIDS, or in China with injecting drug users and same-sex populations. And so, to me, I hope that COVID will teach us the importance of liberal democracies. But, we're also seeing in COVID, another, very worrying dynamic is geopolitical struggles with major UN and other international agencies in between. And as we speak, my own government, President Trump has announced that he's going to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization. And so the WHO has been caught in this geopolitical power struggle between China and the United States, two superpowers. That has enormous implications for health and well-being around the world.
I think, yes, Rami, before we, go ahead.
I can add, to continue what Larry and Erica said, in terms of the social media and the bottom-up reforms that are the best ones that work. One of the really important things that's going on now, and it's not very visible in the mainstream media, but when you dig into it, as I have, and talk to people in these 4 countries I mentioned where there's been ongoing huge popular revolts, 2 things are clear. One, the governments respond initially with military force, not just the government's police and security and army beating up demonstrators, shooting them in some cases, killing a couple of hundred people in Sudan and Iraq and other places, but also the thugs of the political and sectarian rulers. And that militarization, that securitization of the state response to put down the initial uprisings hasn't worked very well, and the uprisings continue and get stronger. The other thing that then happens, which is fascinating, is in the media sector, the most dynamic sector in the media in the Arab world today is the private, independent social media outlets. Most of them are websites, some are radio, some are television, Facebook, TV, live. So there's a place in Lebanon called Thawra TV on Facebook, and you can subscribe and you get a little notice, and they will immediately take you live to any place there's a demonstration, or people gathering for a demonstration. So it's quite an extraordinary reality that the protest movements, instead of demanding, as they did previously, demanding that their governments change and reform and please be nicer to us, they're in a sense, they challenge their governments and then they ignore them and they go and set up their own media. And that's been happening in other areas. For instance, women's groups are among the leaders in these movements, and they're doing extraordinary things in the uprisings, in the on the street organization, in the strategizing, and in the meetings to come up with better situations in countries in the future. Independent unions, a journalists union, lawyers union, doctors unions, now the normal unions or the professional associations, all of which have been taken over by the states, by the autocratic Arab states. Now you're getting independent unions set up by these different professions. And in one case, an independent won the election for the official lawyers union in Lebanon. This is a huge change. So there are these incredibly important changes happening from the ground up, by people who are organizing, mobilizing, strategizing, pushing, coordinating nationally and with their colleagues in other Arab countries. This is the sort of the story of these citizen rebellions that is not well documented in the mainstream media, so people don't tend to hear about them. But these are the signs of real change in the exercise of power. They haven't yet changed the whole system, but they're showing the vulnerabilities of the existing autocratic system, and they're showing how organized citizens can make progress by working in parallel with the official systems.
I wanted to turn the conversation now a bit towards the United States, and Professor Gostin, you touched on this earlier. A recent Politico article described Trump as an authoritarian weak man, which I mean is a contrast to the authoritarian strong man that we've been talking about in this discussion. So Eric, I wanted to ask you, what do you make of this characterization? Do you think it is a fair one, or do you think Trump is a lot more powerful than we give him credit for?
Trump is as powerful as the institutions around him will allow him to be. And by that, I mean that every power grab where there's no pushback by either the judiciary or those within the Republican Party enables him to have more power. Now, in terms of an authoritarian weak man, he is clearly, he behaves in ways that are consistent with other authoritarians around the world, strong or weak. And that is, even the strong man is paranoid and nervous about his survival prospects. So, you know, we hear so many stories of leaders that engage in very erratic and unpredictable behavior because they are so paranoid about their hold on power. And ostensibly, they are strong, and we call them strongmen, but because they have hollowed out all institutions and purged all competent individuals, they tend to not really know how secure their power is. And Trump very much behaves in ways that's consistent with that model. He changes his mind from one moment to the next. Who knows where he's getting his information? We know that he does not seem to be getting much information from individuals that would be considered experts. Instead, he surrounds himself with loyalists. And that is exactly what we see happening in other places where power is concentrated. So it's a facade to say that strong men are really strong, in that they themselves, there's a lot of research that suggests that they're very insecure and their behaviors reflect that. The behavior of Trump throughout the COVID pandemic has been quite troubling, but his behaviors leading up to the pandemic were troubling as well. And the element that I find the most disconcerting is that there are few within the institution, the democratic institutions in the US, that are pushing back in a meaningful way. And historically, one power grab begets another power grab, and it becomes easier to do these things once you've already done it before. For the US, in my opinion, the big test is going to be the November election and the extent to which it is respected There's already a big campaign to try to create doubt about the extent to which we're going to see fraud due to mail-in ballots. And there is no research whatsoever that supports the idea that more mail-in ballots is going to lead to more fraud. Yet that is out there, and there are plenty who believe that if we have mail-in ballots, that we're going to see a fraudulent race. So there are very much concerns over whether, if Trump loses the election, he will respect the outcome, and those within his support group will respect it. There's concerns whether there would be violence over the outcome of the election. It is very much a big test for the democracy in the US, which has clearly backslid since Trump's election.
Yes, Professor Gostin, go ahead.
I think Erica's point that strong leaders or authoritarian leaders are only as strong as the institutions around them allow them to be is a really critically important point. And there's been, the United States has been known to have, fairly robust civil society, used to be a robust judiciary. We have a civil service that's, that's strong. And so one would like to think that there would be kind of this resilient institutional check on the president, but it is very vulnerable, we're seeing. I've been doing a lot of reflecting about, who America is. And if you think about it, I know this is going to be broadcast, in weeks to come, but this week is a really remarkable week for America and the world. In this week, the United States passed the 100,000 case death mark from COVID-19, which is a very grim and sad statistic. More than the Vietnam War, the Iraq wars, and things like that. And that has happened in only a couple of months. We now have the president announcing what I would have thought in my 30 years of working with the World Health Organization and the CDC, an unthinkable proposition to withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization. And our media isn't even covering that because there's something even more consequential as we speak, which is, riots over racial injustice in the United States. So it feels like our country is falling apart, and it would be a very, a lot of people would say in a very positive, rosy way, this is not who we are as America. But clearly that is who we are, at least in part. The injustice is there. We elected this leader. We bungled the COVID response. The president has gone on to, take, hydroxychloroquine, which his own US FDA warned against. It just feels like we're unraveling. But I will say this, that is in part what America has become. Very, very sadly, it makes me, want to almost cry. And particularly when I think back to President Obama and what he represented in the United States and globally. But I will say this, that's not all that we are. There are some really good things. And if I were going to say anything to the Oxford Union, and I have a very, very long relationship with Oxford University and the Union, I would say this, there are really wonderful parts of America. You see it with Erica. You can see it in our scientists and Tony Fauci, and on NIH and CDC. You can see it in our civil society, in Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and all of the wonderful things that America can be. So what this COVID pandemic has done, as many of the great philosophers and storytellers have told us throughout history, is that pandemics bring out the best of us and the worst of us. It's shown a light on our injustice. yes, racial injustice, but economic and all the and health injustices in so many ways. It's proven what Martin Luther King said, that of all the injustices around the world, health injustice is the most unjust. But it's also shown some of our best and brightest. And we just have to fight for this one thing. This is really important. It feels like the world is unraveling with COVID. I swore I would never say anything like what I've seen in China and India and in the United States in terms of these great lockdowns. So which path will we take? Will we take the path of human rights, of building robust health systems with the rule of law and civil society, or we will just unravel into populism, hatred, pointing the blame at one another? And I certainly hope we choose democracy.
Thank you, Professor.
Can
Go
I
ahead.
follow up on those? I want to ask a question and then make a comment so you can then answer the question, both
Okay.
Larry and Erica. My question is, observing the US, I'm a US citizen, a Palestinian, and also a Jordanian citizen. I live in Lebanon, so I have a pretty globalized view of these things. I've spent many years in the US and have huge admiration for so many aspects of the United States, as Larry mentioned. But my suspicion is, so my question first is, I've been struck by if we take away the pandemic, start 3 years ago when Trump came into power, when we started to see some of these negative trends, what we saw, he was pulling out of all kinds of international treaties and things. And we saw one thing which neither of you mentioned, which struck me as really important, which is the pushback from cities and states. And this brings in the federal system of government, on climate change, on immigration, on environmental standards and other issues. I'd love to hear your comments on those. Let me just add to the original question and also to what they said. My impression is the real turning point in the situation that has brought the United States to this very polarized situation today really was the Thatcher-Reagan years. So we can't let the British off here too nicely. So Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan brought a new standard of global values, which was the marketplace, essentially. Some people throw Helmut Kohl into that mix too. But since around 1980 or so, the value system in the US, in England, and globally around the world, the United Kingdom, has revolved more around markets and profits than about the other values that we all respect and adhere to, of equality and justice, etc. And we've seen this process over the last 40 years of globalization, commercialization, polarization, digitization, commodification, and all of these. So the only thing that matters today is making money and having 51% of the parliament, so you can do whatever you want. And I think what we're seeing in the US is the logical extension of this very polarized situation with so different values on both sides, and they're now clashing on the streets. The last point I make is going back to the first question from Mahia about the strongmen. The Arab experience in the last 10 years is instructive. Since the uprisings of 2010 and until today, we had several people like Zain al-Abidin bin Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, Gaddafi in Libya, Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen. They suddenly just dropped. They fled, or they got out of the way because they had no real strength. They were very weakly supported dictators. Essentially, it was the army that supported them. And once the army said, we can't support you, or the army crumbled, they had no power base. So I think it shows you that authoritarianism hinges on a very narrow base of actual power. Others, like Assad in Syria, decided to fight and has destroyed the country. He and others, not just he, many other people who got into the fighting, including Turkey and Russia and Iran and Hezbollah and Islamist groups. So you can either destroy your country, as Assad did, or just get out of the way. So I think the nature of authoritarian incumbency is something we're learning a lot more about. The Sudanese case, I would argue now, is one of the most important things to watch, because the demonstrators were in the streets for a whole year, and a couple hundred of them were killed, and they stuck it out, and they forced the military. First of all, they forced Omar Hassan al-Bashir, the president, to step down. He's then been put in jail. Now he's being tried. They just announced a few days ago that they got $4 billion of stolen money from him and his family back. But the more important thing is that the demonstrating citizens and the organized opposition, many of whom were included, what I mentioned for other countries, independent professional unions. It was the independent professional unions that created an organized opposition and forced the military to negotiate. And they're now in a 3-year transitional process in a joint council with military and civilian, with a civilian at the head of it, with a symbolic civilian one-person edge over the military. And this is extremely important experiment to watch, to see if it might be a means of making a peaceful transition from authoritarian systems essentially run by the military to a more participatory one. The question becomes still, what kind of accountability do you get from the people who committed crimes and theft and corruption and atrocities? And that's still something they have to determine. But I'd like to hear your comments on the state and local power as a response to the...
Sure, I mean,
if I could just kind of supplement that, if you don't mind, with a question of my own, so you can answer it all together. I also just wanted to ask about the role you think governors are playing in all of this. We've seen kind of Andrew Cuomo, we've seen Gretchen Whitmer coming to the fore as a result of this crisis. And I just wonder if you could tell us what this means for the balance of power and keeping Trump in check over the next few months.
Erica, did you want me to start and then you can jump in?
Yeah, you can.
Would you like to? Okay. Yeah, I mean, the United States is a federalist society, and for the most part that served us well, but not. It's not all of the story. Yes, I think, you know, in areas like climate change and COVID, we've certainly seen you know, bottom-up governance. So when the president withdrew us from the Paris Agreement, you know, cities and states came to the fore. During COVID, when we had scarcity of, you know, testing, personal protective equipment, ventilators, and things like that, and there would seem to be chaos from the White House, states started forming compacts among themselves in the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, and on the West Coast of the United States. And so, yes, Mahi, you're right. The you know, governors, mayors have really been in the forefront of this. You can see this now even with the racial riots, where you have, you know, mayors and governors that are being the spokesperson. And so that can be the great blessing of the United States. Justice Brandeis, one of our great Supreme Court justices, once said that, you know, federalism gives us, you know, the laboratory of the states where innovation can shine, and that's true. On the other hand, you know, you've got a pandemic where you really do need a national and global response, and we don't. We've got every state, you know, going on its own, and so that the lack of leadership from the White House, not just nationally but globally, is hurt a lot. If you go back, you know, again to Ebola, influenza H1N1, Zika, you know, President Obama was a great world leader, and whatever you think of George Bush, he formed PEPFAR and is beloved in sub-Saharan Africa. America has been a global leader, you know, it's been for good and bad, not all good, but to see it now, just disowning any kind of, you know, national democratic response or global response. And to see the World Health Assembly and Xi Jinping calling for global unity and Donald Trump and Secretary Pompeo throwing grenades, splintering the world. I mean, it's a sad sight to see, and I never thought I would see it.
Erica.
Yeah, just echoing some of those comments. A public health crisis is usually not the time for decentralization. You want to have the central government leading the response so that things can be coordinated well. And federalism has many positives, particularly for countries like the US and Russia and Brazil that are large populations, large and diverse populations. So there are a lot of positives and flexibility that a federal system will give us. But usually in the past in the US, when we've had crises, we've seen the federal government expand its powers to take control. And the Great Depression would be a good example of that. And instead, during this crisis, we're seeing more decentralization, where states are forced to governors and mayors are trying to deal with it on their own. That's not going to lead to a good concerted response. Likewise, in Russia, Putin handled the outbreak terribly. And he tried to punt it to his governors. They have a federal system. He tried to say, well, the governors are the ones that are responsible, so that he could skirt the blame. But that has backfired for him. And we're seeing something kind of similar going on in Brazil, where Bolsonaro has, I mean, you can't dream up a worse response to the outbreak than Bolsonaro. It's mind-boggling. But he is forcing his governors also to take the lead. And this is leading to some major tensions, particularly in Sao Paulo, which is in a very dire situation right now. So we are seeing these governors have to rise up, but that's not a good thing in a public health crisis.
Yeah.
I wanted to, picking up on the point of Bolsonaro and Trump, I wanted to talk a bit about hydroxychloroquine, which is, of course, the anti-malaria drug that Trump and Bolsonaro, among a few other world leaders, have been taking to allegedly guard against the pandemic, against COVID-19. So this politicization of the drug has been deemed by some as medical populism. So I was wondering, Rami, potentially, if you could jump in here to tell us a bit more about what this term means and the dangers of this rhetoric surrounding hydroxychloroquine.
Well, I can't really talk about the technical sides more than what we've heard from the various scientists who've told us about it, and what the WHO said, that obviously it has some benefits, but not against COVID-19 necessarily. At least it's not proven. But the point is, it's no longer about the actual drug. It's about Trump. This has, you said, has become politicized populist medicine. You have all kinds of things that happen all over the world. Here in the Arab world, we see it a lot. Partly, I mentioned that the government media over the years has lost a lot of credibility. That's why we got all these independent media coming up, social media. But because the government media, nobody believes it very much, or very few people do, the rumor mill around the Arab world is extraordinary. The things that people believe because they hear it from each other, or the grocer, or on some radio show they heard, incredible stories about, we should eat garlic, or we should clean our noses, or stuff that medical people constantly tell you has no impact. You're wasting your time, and some things that could be dangerous. So I think it's really a question of the credibility of information that goes to the citizenry, and whether it's about a specific drug or something else that has wider implications. This gets us back to that broader context that I charted out. From the Thatcher-Reagan years until today, we've seen a kind of commercialization, popularization of almost every aspect of life. Essentially, we've turned into entertainment societies. Government, sports, religion, even education, virtually every aspect of life is like an entertainment industry. And it's to, people enjoy it, and you get a dumbing down of society broadly speaking. You have pockets of real excellence in the American media. There's some outstanding stuff that comes out of the United States and other places in Europe. And but for the most part, the media is really a kind of a dumbed down adjunct to the commercial marketing system in the country. And this has now come into politics as well. So I think it's very hard to change these things. The antidote to wrong information is correct information. But the question is, what are the means, what are the channels through which you can reach a large number of your population? Probably, if we go back to the days of the social marketing campaigns of UNICEF in the 1980s and 90s, which pioneered the process of social communication to reach, peasants in villages in rural Yemen or Upper Egypt. How do you reach the ordinary citizen who may not be literate, who may not own a TV? And the answer is to get people in society that other people respect. So if you can get, whether they're sports figures or actors or politicians or just people who have huge respect in society, if they start speaking out, then you can influence a lot of people. But this is a big challenge now for societies all over the world.
Professor Gostin, if you could jump in on this, and if you could also just touch on the role of the CDC that you mentioned earlier and the way Trump is kind of dealing with federal agencies around issues of healthcare.
Yeah, thank you, Mahi. I will do that. First, let me just talk about what Rami said, and then I want to kind of get to really what are the take-home lessons that we should really learn from what we've been discussing. Rami talked about the importance of, good information, and Erica also did with social media before as well. It is a real problem. And, we can see it in the anti-vaccination campaigns. You can see it in the polio eradication efforts where polio workers are shot or killed, in measles epidemics around the world, in Europe, the United States, Africa, and other areas. So there is a real dearth of health literacy that we need to kind of figure out, and social media is not a really good tool for actually allowing us to do that. And I've been working, trying to push social media with Facebook, Twitter, and others about how they can be better citizens and do a better job. But I wanted to just really talk about two take-home messages that really, I think, are the key to it. We've talked a lot about, strong leaders, populism, authoritarian leaders, but there's one thing and we've talked about how they dampen civil society and free press and take power, but there's another really important thing that they tend to do, which is to discount science and experts, and including their own agency experts. That is a truly troubling matter. I've often said in my talking and my writing that that good science leads to good ethics, leads to good policy, and so it all starts, with a respect for science, evidence, objective truth, and CDC would be a great example of that, with the president literally undermining the CDC. I've mentioned I'm the director of the World Health Organization Center on Global Health Law. I directed CDC Center for many years. And the attack on these pillars of science and public health, the WHO and the CDC, the blaming of them, the discounting of them, with NIH and Tony Fauci in the United States, where all the scientists are kind of looking over their shoulder at the White House. And once Vice President Pence said, he wants all of the scientists to clear messages with the White House. really should be the opposite way. The White House should be clearing their messages with the scientists. So the kind of anti-expert, anti-science way of doing things with vaccination, COVID, climate change, all of those areas, I think are, critically important part of the story. And hydroxychloroquine is only one example of that. It's clearly no evidence that it's effective, literally no evidence that it could be a prophylactic in the way that the President Trump is taking it or was taking it. The Lancet recently had a study of elevated cardiovascular risks for those taking it. So it's right now, as far as we know, it's a dangerous drug. And that's what the health agencies have said. But here's the other, and maybe even a bigger issue, is that, one day we are going to have good treatments and probably a vaccine. The vaccine in particular, as I've kind of described as the race for the moon. There's a race between Europe, China. Oxford is one in the race. The United States for gaining technological superiority. That is the holy grail, and there's nothing more important to getting our lives back in order, get our economy in order. But think about this. What if we hoard that? What if we defend it and put a box around vaccines with intellectual property and the TRIPS agreement at the World Trade Organization? What if one day people in Europe and the United States and perhaps China are protected against COVID, and people in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa are dying in the millions? Think about how that would unravel global solidarity and international affairs. And so we need to be thinking now, even before we have a treatment or a vaccine, about the equitable distribution of that global public good. There will be nothing more important to the world than when we start to get good treatments, good medications, good vaccines. We've seen it play out in a small way with personal protective equipment and testing and ventilators, where it's a free-for-all and it goes to the highest bidder. Think about what that would mean if we really had a good treatment and a good vaccine. We need to start thinking about equity, and we need to start doing it urgently and now.
I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to one final question from me and then take some questions from the audience. So I wanted to talk to you, Erica. I wanted to ask you about technology and the way in which it is interacting with authoritarianism in this pandemic. So in India, for instance, we've recently seen an app that was launched which uses Bluetooth and GPS technology to track and trace cases and saves them into an external federally controlled server. What impact do you see kind of tracking and surveillance technologies having on civil liberties, particularly in countries like India with little or no data protection legislation?
Yeah, so this is one of those tricky things where, on the one hand, it would be a great idea if they could track everyone to limit the spread of the virus, just like it is a good idea to limit protests right now. Large groups could lead to super spreading events and so forth. But the issue is always, well, what are these governments going to do with this information? Also, when are they going to relax some of their control over the populace? The issue is not what, say, Iceland would do if it was surveilling and monitoring. We're more concerned about what's going to happen in places like India, which have already been deteriorating in terms of the quality of their democracy. So in some ways, my impression is that the developments in India, the Philippines, and Hungary are really consistent with the trend that they've been on more generally. It's not surprising that some of these places are going to be leveraging these tools. They already were doing things that were, raised red flags. China and Russia are also good examples where they already had surveillance technology in place. But now, in the case of Russia, they're just using this as the moment to let it free. There are also concerns that some observers don't think that the Russian technology is actually that good at facial recognition, but regardless, they're deploying it under the name of under the guise of public health. And China is also doing the same thing. China was already doing this earlier, though. They've been tracking their citizens for some time using sophisticated technologies and also exporting these technologies to other countries. Uganda, for example, has purchased some Chinese surveillance technologies. These new tools, our research has shown, tend to help dictatorships stay afloat for the reasons that you might expect. One of the main things that they do is give these regimes better information of who their opponents are. So rather than having to do broad censorship, they can do more subtle forms of censorship that enable them to figure out who their main threats are. And in that way, they are becoming more robust. So it's not, again, it's not a new news that these countries are doing these things, but they're just kind of ratcheting it up because of this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Professor Austin.
Yeah, I mean, I just had an article last week in the Journal of the American Medical Association on digital tracing apps and the kind of balance between public health and human rights and privacy. So we're, the digital apps have been used in all over the world, everywhere from beginning in China, where it had red, yellow, and green codes about where you could travel, and everybody had them on their mobile devices. But they're also were used very effectively in places like South Korea and Taiwan. The UK is currently doing a pilot project on digital tracing. Israel has used it successfully. There's a lot of discussion here in the United States about how will we use it. So there is a way to use digital technology in ways that are positive for public health. Contact tracing, the manual systems of what we now know as, test, trace, isolate as the kind of core public health interventions. Manual doesn't always cut it. You do sometimes need technological tools. But once you start using them and for spillover, location, facial recognition, police, immigration, national security, that's when you worry. And that's why you have to go back to the guardrails. What are the legal and institutional restraints against improper use of these things? And that's why having robust, resilient institutions that can fight against these kinds of instincts is so critical. And the problem in the world is that both our national institutions as well as our international institutions are being eroded by this nationalistic, populistic, pro-sovereignty mood that we've seen, and we're seeing it all over the world. We just need to fight back against that.
I'm turning now to audience questions, just in the interest of time, if you don't mind. And Rami, I did want to go to you on this first audience question. It is from Jansu at Pembroke, and she asks, has the COVID-19 crisis taken away attention from other atrocities authoritarian states are carrying out, such as China in Hong Kong, China and the Uyghurs, United States in the Middle East, and the United States and Black people?
I think the answer is definitely yes. There's so much focus on COVID-19 that the human brain and the heart doesn't have enough capacity to deal with all of the other atrocities and terrible things that are going on. But this lasts for a couple of months, and then the brain and the heart resume their normal activities, and they start saying, well, okay, we're dealing with COVID-19, we're still alive, most of us are still alive, we're not going to die. We've got these terrible things going on around the world: occupation, subjugation, racism, etc. And the surveillance technology, which we've heard from Lawrence and Erica, is one of the big issues now in the Middle East. You know, Saudi Arabia, for instance, has used it for some years, and the United Arab Emirates. They buy it from Israel mostly, and they keep track of their citizens abroad now and try to lure them back, like they did with Jamal Khashoggi, who they assassinated. I was in touch with Jamal a few months before he died in the US, and he said, look, I can't talk on the phone because I'm being followed. They're following me, the Saudis, and we now have much more evidence of this. The Egyptians do this. Many Arab governments now are doing this. They're using this technology to spy on their opponents. So the difficulty, the real difficulty with this issue is that, and this kind of answers your question with these other terrible things that are going on, is that authoritarian, autocratic governments can do these terrible things, whether they're doing them to the Rohingya or the Uyghur or to dissidents or whatever, or the Israelis to Palestinians. They do these things. They say, we're doing this according to our laws. We're not breaking any laws. The government says our laws permit us to fight terrorism. Our laws permit us to fight creating chaos in the country. And that's exactly what these governments say now when they arrest people. They say, you're fomenting tension and stress and violence, disrupting the peace, hurting national security, and you're joining a terrorist group. Anybody they don't like, they call a terrorist group. So this is a very common threat around the region. And you see it in a different vocabulary coming out of the White House now, where the president says something and on all his supporters, they say, well, these are left-wing radical communists. They don't call them communists so much anymore, but left-wing radicals and Democrats or whatever. So you just put this label on somebody and then you can do whatever you want to them. And in the final analysis, authoritarianism and the abuse of power and the denial of people's human rights and basic human dignity are the consequence of a power equation in which all power, or most of it, is concentrated in the hands of the governing elite. It could be one person, it could be a whole regime, but and most ordinary citizens can't do anything about it. And that's why in the final analysis, whether it was Ferguson or today, this week in Minneapolis, or in Newark, I remember in the late 60s, early 70s, I was in the US, or in Palestine for 20 years, or in Iraq, citizens have no other option but to go out onto the street and demand that they be treated like human beings. And sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. So this is an ongoing issue, and it's been with us for, as long as there's been governed societies where power is concentrated in the hands of a central government. And this is interesting. I wrote books on archaeology for many years when I lived in Jordan. And when you go back throughout history, governance systems were much more decentralized. They were tribal, they were religious, they were local. And the kind of thing we're getting now, mass national uprisings, are a relatively modern phenomenon.
Thank you, Rami. If you don't mind, we can take one more question from the audience, and very quickly, if we can answer this one. This one is from Adam at St. Edmund Hall, and he says, there have been debates around the legitimacy of mandatory vaccination, broadly speaking. Do you think that more authoritarian regimes would be able to easily bring about this policy? And what nature do you think the debate on this will take, if it will exist? So Eric, I just wanted to go to you very quickly on this.
Yeah, this is an important question, right? The extent to which, if we do get a vaccine, people will take the vaccine, and also the extent to which certain countries will hoard vaccines, which is definitely a serious problem. The authoritarian model is better suited for a mandatory vaccine campaign, certainly. There have also been disasters with authoritarians doing mandatory campaigns of any sort. And the risk with authoritarians is that they're going to have a mandatory campaign for something that's ineffective, because they tend to not have good expertise within them. Now, what will happen in democracies that are trying to push for vaccines? It depends on the context and the extent to which the citizenry trusts their leaders. Because we're seeing in Russia, for example, that the citizens don't really trust their leadership, and so a lot of them are not adhering to public health guidelines, and it's exacerbating the crisis. In the US, we are a mess in terms of knowing who to trust. And the anti-vaccination campaigns in the US have actually gotten stronger during the COVID outbreak, which is very troubling. But I'm not the public health expert, so I will pass the baton.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that for a safe and effective vaccine like childhood vaccines, polio vaccination, influenza vaccination, or for hepatitis B, or for if we ever get one for COVID, to try to increase coverage so that we get what's now called herd, but it's community immunity, is a good thing. And the real question is it based upon science? What is the most effective way to gain public trust and compliance? Many democracies do have some form of vaccine mandate. Australia does. The US certainly does with school-based vaccinations. In the UK, you pay your GPs to get as many people vaccinated in their practice as they can. So it can be good, they can be, compulsory vaccination isn't an evil in and of itself. But if it were used as a kind of a tool of repression, if it were somehow we forced people to take vaccines that weren't vetted by the World Health Organization, other scientific bodies, that would be a great problem. But looking at Rami and knowing the Middle East as well as I do, and many of the health ministers there, most of the good ones try to get their populations vaccinated. Normally, we shouldn't associate vaccinations and authoritarianism in the same breath. Normally, in good, civil society, respecting countries, you can have vaccination campaigns, but you just have to do it right.
Great. Thank you all so much. I think that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure hosting you for an extremely insightful discussion. Thank you.